Willkommen! I'm John Denor, and this is Goblin Points. This time, I have the pleasure of having community member Ashley on the podcast. I was introduced to Ashley in a playtest we did together, and in the post-play chat, I found her thoughts interesting. And today, I get to share some of them with you. Ashley and me actually ended up speaking for so long that I've had to split the interview into 2 parts. I like to keep the episodes under 30 minutes, and I'm not able to strictly keep that in this instance. There was just too much good stuff. And before we jump in, I have to apologize for my microphone during the interview. It does a weird clipping thing and cuts off my words. I'll try to get that fixed for the next interview. Ashley sounds good though. Let's jump in. Welcome to Goblin Points, Ashley.
Hello.
So first off, introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about yourself, what you do, both in relation to MCDM, but also like maybe other TTRPG stuff, or just any other creative endeavor.
Well, I'm Ashley. I'm a game developer in video games. I'm sort of like a solo type indie creator, rather than somebody who works for a studio. I'm primarily known for a puzzle game, like an arcade-style puzzle game I made called Pedal Crash, which I made back and released back in 2020. And it's since got a sort of like a little bit of a following, like primarily a following of like arcade puzzle freaks who love all the same kind of old weird puzzle games I do. But we recently had a crowdfund for Pedal Crash 2, the new Pedal Crash, and it was pretty successful, so that's what I'm working on now. I actually just got done shipping out a whole bunch of backer rewards, like posters and enamel pins and stuff, going to the post office with like towers of boxes.
Great, congratulations on the crowdfunder then.
Thank you.
As a matter of form, I have to ask, how did you come across MCDM or Matt Colville? And what made you stick around in the community?
I'm a really big D&D fan. I wasn't allowed to be into D&D as a kid, so I missed out a lot on it in my youth. But when I was an adult, a friend got me really big into D&D. I think this was around when 4th edition came out, but my friend was like a 3rd edition diehard. So I first got into 3rd edition, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was fun. I really liked like role playing and getting into character. I really liked the mix of like sort of on one hand you're like trying to embody this character and trying to get into their psyche and stuff, but on the other hand you're also trying to use all of your cool powers to fight monsters in the best way you can. And I always really liked that mix of these two things that a lot of people often say are at odds. Which I don't believe they are, but we'll get to that. I got super into D&D. That was also around when the Pathfinder playtest for the first Pathfinder edition started. So in our campaign, we actually started in 3.5 and transitioned to the Pathfinder playtest and then to the Pathfinder like final rules throughout that campaign, which did end up finishing after a while. While I was into D&D, I did get opportunities to try every other edition. I got my friend who was the 3.5 diehard like started going backwards and getting more into the older and older editions. So I got to try 4th edition, I got to try 2nd edition, I got to try like Beck Me rules. So I sort of, it was very interesting to me to see sort of experiencing like sort of all at once the sort of entire history of this game and how it evolved. Like I didn't like start out with an earlier edition and then transition to later ones. I kind of just kind of got into all of them at the same time. Which is very interesting. And also, we got really big into the 5th edition playtest. So I also got to see, like, not only, like, Pathfinder, like, the playtests going through that process, but the 5th edition one, which was a lot more dramatically, like, a thing being made from scratch, and not just, like, a refinement of an earlier edition. So, I would say that, like, making video games is my job, and tabletop RPGs is my hobby.
Uh-huh.
So the way I got involved with MCDM is, for a while, ever since I moved to where I live now, I didn't really have any like D&D friends and stuff, and I sort of fell off the hobby for a while. I never stopped liking it. I would still keep up on like D&D stuff, and like all of my games have like tons of like D&D references in them. Pedal Crash, my video game, I hired a writer I was a fan of, Zach Morrison, who makes the webcomic Paranatural, is what they're primarily known for. Oh. And after that, we became friends. And then Zach's partner's friend was like getting into a D&D game and wanted to get more people in, so they invited, I think they invited Zach, and I don't remember how the invitation also got extended to me, but we played a few sessions of that game, but it didn't end up actually going anywhere. Mm. But that's when Zach was actually getting into playing D&D, like actually playing it instead of mostly just like enjoying podcasts and such. Then after that campaign kind of fizzled out, we got invited to another campaign because their party needed like a tank. They're like, who do we know that plays D&D that'd be willing to come in and be a tank? And then like both me and Zach were like, oh, we can both go in and be tanks. So we made characters that were like twins, who was they were playing a paladin and I was an eldritch knight, and they had kind of like opposite personalities where Zach's character was very like boisterous and glamorous, and my character was very like nerdish and timid. And
nice.
It was extremely fun. So that campaign went to almost its end, but it ended up having to stop right before we got to the big climax of it. It was pretty disappointing. Mm. But we did play that for a long time. So I got back into D&D after Pedal Crash came out, and me and Zach basically got back into it together. As for how I came across Matt Colville, it's the YouTube algorithm, basically. YouTube somehow found out I was into D&D, as it does, and started recommending me D&D videos, and I would click on them, and I would watch some of them. I didn't stick around for like most of them, but there's a few channels I watch, like watch pretty closely, like Z-Bashu's like animated spellbook type videos. The Pack Tactics, the little kobold guy who talks about optimization, and MCDM, Matt Colville. So like watching those videos, like the way Matt like talks, he's like very captivating. He's very like I could like I watched more of his videos, and I watched videos on stuff like I didn't even know about or wasn't interested, because like just watching that guy talk is like fascinating, and it's like kind of infectious. So the MCDM was one of the channels I basically stuck around with just because I really liked his videos. And from there I started to look more into like the MCDM tabletop products. Like I watched all those videos where he would reference the stuff he did in Strongholds and Followers. But I got Strongholds and Followers. I heard they had thoughts of like revising Strongholds and Followers for a while, but I think with their focus on the new RPG, that probably is no longer on the top of their list. Especially with like the whole OGL debacle, like throwing the fate of third-party 5th edition stuff in question for a while.
What it sounded like, Matt talked about it on a stream probably a year ago at this point, where he said that he basically wanted to bring back the rules, but the revised version of them, and just put them in like a box set for the new RPG. So like for some of like the Kingdoms and Warfare rules about intrigue and kind of political conflicts, he just wants to stuff those rules in the Capital box set, basically, because that's where the rules fit in with like the kind of games you want to run in Capital.
Yeah, like Kingdoms and Warfare is very much like this is a thing you get for a specific kind of campaign.
Yeah.
Like, it wouldn't make sense to get Kingdoms and Warfare if you were going to play, like, Curse of Strahd or something, necessarily. I think you could work it in. Yeah. You could work in, like, your characters, like, making a foothold in Barovia or whatever. So I didn't get Kingdoms and Warfare, but I did back Flee Mortals, because I really enjoyed all the stuff they said about making monsters, like, more dynamic and interesting, and I was really excited to see where that went. And I got the book, and it's pretty good. I haven't gotten to use it yet. But
it reads well.
It reads well. I really want to sometime just get a bunch of people together for a one-shot and run some of the Where Evil Lives layers.
Yeah.
I think they're put together really well. Like, I will say, in Strongholds and Followers, the adventure in Strongholds and Followers is extremely good. Reading that, I felt very like, I could totally run this, and I bet it would be really fun. They had a really good structure of, like, here are the things that happen, and here's why they happen, and if different stuff happens. You basically get a sense of, like, I think Matt's talked about this before. Like, it's important to know what would happen if the heroes didn't do anything. Like, what are the villains trying to accomplish?
Yeah.
And like, getting a sense of, like, knowing who the villain is and what their plan is and what is happening and, like, what's important to know. Like, getting that all laid out very clearly. That's very apparent in the Strongholds and Followers adventure and in the Where Evil Lives layers.
Yeah.
I got a really positive impression of their, like, adventure design. So what got me into the new RPG is I was already interested in what MCDM was doing. They talked about, like, this idea of making their own, like, fighting monsters RPG from the ground up with, like, this very clear vision as to what the game is and isn't. Yeah. Like, the video, What Are Dungeons For, that he made.
Yes.
Is, like, the really big one where he talks about, like, how he's not sure what the vision of 5th edition is supposed to be, and how it's kind of tied up in this legacy of this ancient game that is, like, no longer what it once was. And how it still has to hold on to, like, the traditions. If you made, like, 6th edition D&D and took out one of the 6 stats, you would get, like, drawn and quartered.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, even if you got rid of, like, the 3 to 18 range and just said, we'll just use only just the modifier, people would still, like, throw spears into your chests. So there's so much they can't do with it.
Are you aware of DC 20?
I'm aware of it. I took a peek at it.
Yeah, I looked through the rules preview they had in the crowdfunder.
You're not going to dethrone D&D by making D&D but better in the ways that you think it is. That's like that's the sort of fantasy heartbreaker idea of, like, taking D&D and trying to publish your own cooler, better version of D&D that's cooler and better in the way that you think it's cool and better.
Yeah.
Which I completely see the appeal of doing that. I have had many of my own thoughts about, like, well, if I was going to make my own version of D&D, here's what I would do. I've, like, written down stuff about, like, okay, I'm going to combine some of the stats so there's only 4 stats. I'm going to try and get rid of the idea of, like, the action and the bonus action and just give you, like, 2 actions, stuff like that. I think what got me started on that was the OGL debacle, and I was like, my idea was like, okay, I'll make a kind of different-ish version of it and then release it under Creative Commons. But then they released DSRD under Creative Commons, and then I was immediately like, oh, now I don't have to. So, I don't personally see a lot of value in making D&D again.
No.
So,
ditto.
Like, the fact that this game is, like, very clear about what it is, very clear about what it isn't, and the idea that they're going to re-examine the core assumptions of the sort of D&D-like game, I thought was a very appealing idea of, like, not just taking D&D and fixing it, but making a new game in the D&D, like, tradition, but with, like, clarity of vision and, like, without all of the legacy cruft that D&D accumulated over the past, like, half a century.
It's so wild that it's that old.
Yeah.
Like, it's the 50th anniversary. I'm like, oh shit, it's that old. I forgot.
Yeah, the 70s was 50 years ago. So, what got me into the community in particular, like, all of this was I'd never even set foot in the MCDM community before this. Matt Colville made a tweet or something about their idea of kits that linked to the Patreon post. He talked a little bit about the concept of, like, instead of picking bespoke equipment, you just have, like, a set of gear that sort of defines your character flavor ways. I thought that was a really cool and interesting idea, and then I, like, clicked the Patreon post, and was like, oh, it's patrons only. And then I was like, well, I've been interested enough in this that I might as well just become a patron so I could, like, read this and participate of it. So I joined the Patreon because I was doing well enough financially at the time. And I read the kits post and I found it, like, very exciting. I joined the MCDM community and went into the patrons channel and immediately started talking about all of my cool ideas for how this RPG would go and learning that you're not allowed to do that immediately. Like, I feel like I'm not the only one who has that experience.
No, that's very common, yeah.
Yeah. But I did feel like very inspired by a lot of the new ideas in the game.
Kits is kind of I'd been a patron before they started working on the RPG, and so I was just kind of riding the wave, I guess. Kits was kind of the first idea in the new RPG that kind of made me go, that kind of blew my mind, where, I never come up with this. I'm not that of a creative person, it has to be said, but it seemed so revolutionary to me. And that was kind of like my first glimpse or like taste of this is actually different. This is just not rehashing D&D or some other RPG. They're actually really, as Matt has said multiple times, but that kind of made it clear to me that he meant we were actually going to kind of rethink everything and start from the bottom and try to figure all this out from the bottom up.
Yeah.
What are we actually, what if we throw out all the old assumptions and actually think about it?
What is equipment for in our game? I think that is a very good indicator of the fact that they're willing to re-examine all of the assumptions. Like weapons and armor, what is weapons and armor for in this kind of game we're making? I also think what's very appealing is the fact that they know what the game isn't. Yeah. Like they, because I feel like a lot of we are fixing D&D type new projects like DC-20 and Black Flag and everything. No shade on them. They're doing good work, and I'm sure lots of people are going to enjoy what they're making. But I feel like with the idea of, we're going to take everything about D&D and improve it, seems like less focused and less appealing to me than the idea of we're going to take one of the parts of the experience of playing D&D and laser focus in on just that.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to make a game that's a good survival horror dungeon crawler while also being a larger than life monster fighting game, while also being a narrative intrigue game. I really appreciate the clarity of vision with the new game. Also, another thing about the MCDM RPG that really appeals to me is that a lot of indie RPGs that are not D&D, a lot of them have they're very narrative focused in a way that is something I personally am not a big fan of. Say, for example, your average Powered by the Apocalypse game is very much you don't necessarily have a character with abilities as much as you have a character concept with a list of story beats that you introduce into the story sort of thing.
Okay, yeah.
And I always thought that if I was just going to write a story, I don't need rules for that kind of thing. I really appreciate more the sort of emergent stories that happen when you play a game with more game-like rules. And sure, a lot of the time that means a lot of unsatisfying and undramatic things happen.
Sure.
But also a lot of satisfying dramatic things happen because of the choices you made as a character.
Yeah.
Not necessarily because the rules would tell you that now is the time when a dramatic thing happens, you know?
I remember, I don't know if you're aware of Puffin Forest. That's his he has these really simplistic animated D&D stories, but he's really good at storytelling. And he has this incredible video where he talks about the party losing to the big bad at the end of the campaign.
I think I saw this video.
Yeah, and it's so
this big moment, and they just miss.
Yeah, and it's just in some way it's so anticlimactic, but on the other hand, it's kind of peak TTRPGs in a way. In what other story would this happen?
Yeah. When I'm playing D&D, I really appreciate that I'm playing a game where I have a character who has cool powers and such. And I feel like there's this undercurrent of, in a lot of indie TTRPGs, that's a very juvenile way to feel. Of that
oh, yeah.
Yeah, there's this idea that wanting to play a game about having cool powers and fighting monsters is sort of puerile, which I don't think it is.
No, this actually reminds me of Matt talking about what people thought of D&D in the 90s, where it was kind of this old style, you fight monsters, primitive, childish game, and these new story-driven TTRPGs like Vampire the Masquerade and all these these kinds of games are what's kind of mature and like the next evolution of TTRPGs.
I will say that like a lot of this is very personal and biased, and also like based on impressions I've gotten in the past, which may no longer be true. Mm-hmm. I'm not like terribly involved in the scene, and I don't like talking in a way that suggests that the way I feel is the correct way to feel.
Yeah, sure.
Games like that are like powered by the apocalypse and stuff are extremely popular for a reason.
Sure.
Because people do enjoy them, and I don't think they're wrong for enjoying them. But it's just kind of a very personal thing for me, where it's like it's just not the kind of game I like.
Yeah.
And something I do appreciate about the MCDM RPG is like this is a game about larger than life heroes using cool powers to fight monsters, and like that's not a thing that is juvenile. It is not a thing that is like that has no value. It is also not a thing that can't be done better than it is done in D&D.
Right.
Having this like this focus of like we're gonna take what we think is a fun part of D&D, like the tactical monster fighting part, and build a game that is focused around that first. Crucially, it also still is a role-playing game. Like it's not just like a war game or like a monster fighting skirmish board game.
Mm-hmm.
Like they still like put a lot of effort into like the stuff you do should like narratively make sense in the world. There's like powers you can use that only make sense if you're like imagining existing in this world from the perspective of your character, kind of things.
Yeah.
The MCDM RPG is the only tabletop RPG that I've seen in like the indie space that A has that as a focus of their style of play, and B is not just a D&D rework.
Right.
Okay, I wouldn't say only. I think that's kind of unfair. I think maybe 7th Age is one of those kind of games, but I haven't really looked into it very deeply.
Okay.
I believe it's like a 4th edition style. Is it called 7th Age?
Yeah, I think
Something Age.
I think it's 7th Age. 14th Age?
7th
No.
Age.
13th Age.
13th Age, right. 7th C, 13th Age. Okay, I had blended those two things together in my mind.
It sounded so right when you said it, but
that's what happened. 13th Age, 7th C, I think those are similar to each other also in Vision, so I think it is reasonable of me to mix those up. But also I feel like both of those are sort of more in the D&D tradition. They're also older and haven't really gotten huge followings, I don't think. I will admit there's a lot of appeal in like getting in on the ground floor of something new with the MCDM RPG.
Right, yeah. Ditto.
That also sort of plays into it. Like, I do want to check out 13th C and 7th Age. I do want to look into those at some point.
Was there something else you wanted to add about the community, by the way?
Well, the MCDM Discord is very tightly moderated. I noticed immediately.
Yeah.
There are rules. You can't even use emojis from like outside of the server. Like they are very focused on like clamping down a good vibe, I would say. And I think that is a positive thing because I've had like a lot of very good experiences in the MCDM community that I haven't had in other like tabletop communities. Like tabletop RPG people are like they can be very opinionated and very like vicious in like defending their opinions. I don't think that's controversial to say.
No, I don't think so at all.
So the MCDM community, by contrast, people tend to be like a lot more positive. People tend to be more patient.
Yeah.
People, it's hard to describe, but it feels it's very welcoming, but it's also very. I don't know how to say it.
Yeah, I kind of know what you mean. It's welcoming, but it's strict in a way. So
the strictness is not to its detriment. It's a positive.
Yes.
It took a little bit of getting used to.
I think I actually saw someone bounce off. They came in and they asked like a couple of questions, and they immediately got like one of the moderators were immediately on them. This is not the kind of things we allow in this channel or in this community. And they were like, well, I'm in the Patreon thing and blah blah blah. And they're like, well, that's not no excuse. These are like our guidelines and our rules. And they were like, well, if that's the case, I'll just leave. And I think they actually did. They were only in like the Discord server for like maybe 12 hours.
Wow. I think that like getting people to bounce off your community is not necessarily a negative.
Sure.
There's a lot of Discord communities I peek into that like are not as strict, and therefore like people who stick around who like don't necessarily break any rules but just kind of had bad vibes.
Yeah.
There'll be a lot of those kind of people. I appreciate that the MCDM community is very proactive in like making sure their community is like a good place to exist in.
Yeah.
Not recently, but a while ago, there was the Patreon post about montage tests, this idea of a sort of skill challenge type mechanic in the MCDM RPG. And like skill challenges was one of my like least favorite things in 4th edition. So I had like a whole lot of like opinions about the way montage tests were like currently presented and the things that I thought were problems with it. And like for hours I debated with people in the patron channel like about my point of view and like the things I didn't like about it and like the pitfalls I could see that the game falling into and my worries about it. And like even people who like really disagreed with me were like very civil about it.
Yeah.
Like there were no like personal attacks. There was like a lot of people on both sides being like, you're making a valid point and I can see this from your perspective kind of deal.
Yeah.
Like it was the most civil tabletop RPG argument I have ever been a part of in my entire life. And it like went on for a really long time. And just at the end of it, nobody felt like gross about it. Nobody like was mad at anybody else. We were just like, it seemed like everybody was primarily interested in like understanding the point of view of the other person, which was like mind-blowing. That never happens.
Just internet in general, that never happens.
Yeah. So I was extremely pleasantly surprised to see people be so like civil and respectful in this debate that we were having.
Yeah, that's really great.
In like the next version of the playtest packet, there was stuff in there that like addressed my worries. So, yeah, because like a lot of the stuff they were talking about, like after poor lead designer James Introcaso came in and had to read all of that debate. Like I think like Matt came in first and literally said, "I'm not reading all of this." And then James Introcaso came in and he did read all of it. And he talked about how like he was surprised at like some of the criticisms of the montage test because they made assumptions about how it was run that they hadn't envisioned.
Right.
So they're like, oh, part of why people have a problem with this is because we didn't like communicate how it's intended to be run clearly. So
I really like that about the whole, I guess, design process in general, where they're very, very strict about not giving suggestions or kind of ideas of how things should be solved. They want to sell us their design. But I also find that it's really interesting that I really respect the choice that we want these specific things. This kind of comes back to you mentioning that they know what the RPG is about and what it's not about. But they have like these very clear ideas of what they want to include in the game, and they want feedback that tells them how players feel about the rules, not necessarily how they work. So this rule makes me feel this one when we use it, and I don't like that feeling. So you go fix it, and they really encourage they encourage that kind of feedback where you just say, this didn't work for me. The vibes were off, and they were like, okay, we'll fix the vibes because we want this part in. We want negotiation rules to be in the game, but we see that vibe is off, so we'll fix the vibe.
Yeah, I've also been like sort of surprised sometimes by like the way they would address feedback of things that were received poorly. Something that's like, oh, I would have never thought of like this solution to it, but it works. But also a lot of times it's like, oh, this is a thing that I would have suggested if I was allowed to, and they came to the same conclusion, and I get to feel a little bit like a very special smart person. Like, I knew it, I totally knew it. But,
And that's where we end it for now. I have a whole other episode of conversation for you in the next interview episode. So look out for that on the 20th of August. A temporary thank you to Ashley for the conversation so far. Everything she mentioned is linked in the show notes and on goblinpoints.com. If you want to be on Goblin Points, do not hesitate to send me an email on tips@goblinpoints.com. Until next time, snackis.